Welcome. Bruchim Abaim, I am Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi, and you have found Beit Virtuali. Now, by having a title of a video such as I am religious and not spiritual, it's obvious that I'm trying to not only be provocative, but to do a bit of a tongue-in-cheek send-off on something that I have heard a lot in my life. I'm guessing that you have too. I'm guessing you probably have said it at some point. I know that I've definitely said it at some point, and when people have said that to me in my civilian years, it's usually on some sort of continuum between actually wrestling with what someone is trying to come up with in order to be able to deal relationally with that which is incomprehensible, and on the other side, it's an excuse. Oftentimes an excuse for when a subject comes up like religion, which obviously can have no negative consequences in a conversation whatsoever, that oftentimes it's an easy way to get out of the conversation. I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. But it's actually a phrase when I hear uttered these days that I've become less and less over the course of the years tolerant of hearing. And indeed, as a rabbi, well, there's also a continuum. On the one hand, there are once again the people who are in that wrestling and trying to find what that means. And on the other hand, there are people who are saying that as a way of trying to get out of the conversation of synagogue membership or paying dues. And before I jump into the meat of this video, I really want to give two disclaimers. Disclaimer number one is that I'm going to be talking about ritual and religious practice, and so that it doesn't come off as hypocritical, I struggle with these things myself. As my first homiletics teacher in rabbinical school said, never give a sermon for someone else. Always just give the sermon for yourself and assume that everyone else is going through, or many other people are going through the same thing that you are. So listen, I've got ADHD, I've got my own struggles with this one, so this is part of me working out my own struggles. And the other is it's going to sound a little bit preachy, missionary sort of stuff. And Judaism is a non-proselytizing religion. I am very much on the we should have a religious practice that leads us to our spirituality. I could really care less what your tradition is, as long as it is a tradition that leads you to lift others up and not tear them down. And indeed to lift oneself up and not tear oneself down. But that being said, I want to meditate a little bit or unpack a little bit on what I think is being said when someone says, I'm spiritual but not religious. Now, I'm not trying to tell you what you think, but I think that when people say those words, they're not always aware of why they say them. I think that there's a specific series list of potentials that bring someone to say those things. Some of them very understandable. Some of them are going to sound a little bit preachy and uncomfortable, and welcome to Beit Virtuali. But at the end of the day, if we say, I'm spiritual but not religious, and we're not aware of why we're saying it, well, then we're missing out on a pathway to spirituality, because spirituality is predicated on full awareness of why we're doing what we're doing in present time. So let's just dive right into the list, and I'll start off with, I think, what the absolute biggest one is, at least in my experience as a congregational rabbi and as a pastoral counselor, and that is that someone has had a bad experience with religion, usually in their youth. And these bad experiences, as we know from the news, can be really, really bad experiences. But there's a continuum of being misunderstood or finding oneself out of place, all the way to the things that I really don't want to talk about today. But either way, those experiences with a religious organization or a religious leader are oftentimes the ontos of us never wanting to step foot in a church, synagogue, mosque, temple. Again, if that's the case, we should admit that to ourselves. We should be able to say, listen, the reason I don't want to go back into a synagogue is because of this thing. That brings the energy of the past into present time. It means that we can deal with it. From a psychological and therapeutic standpoint, everything that's remaining in the past and not being dealt with are things that are preventing us from living a full life. There's a certain amount of our life energy that's being stuck to that memory, and we need that energy to live. So if we can at least admit this and bring it to the present, then we already have a victory. Now, a little bit less controversial, the most common excuse that I've heard when people later on in life come to synagogue and haven't been to synagogue in many years, it's that they had a bad experience in their bar and bat mitzvah training. And oftentimes these are people who are incredibly thoughtful, incredibly creative, and in a class of X amount of people, there was a teacher who just didn't want to deal with them. Many people have had that experience of asking the question, did Adam have a navel, sort of things, or who was Lot's wife and where did she come from? And having a religious school teacher who said, that's a bad question, or worse, you're a bad person for asking that question. And shame on those teachers for doing that. Oftentimes that's out of their own fear, but there are processes around that. And I'm going in a completely different direction that I wanted to, but you remember the one negative thing, but you don't necessarily remember the 100 positive things that happened, which is kind of how marketing works in general. When I worked in marketing, we were told day one, this was for a hospital in Philadelphia, if someone has a good experience with a doctor, they're going to tell 2 or 3 people. If they have a bad experience, they're going to tell 10. And that was before the age of Twitter and other social media where we can actually create a pile-on. And that might be, if you have a good experience at a doctor. Listen, when I post something positive, I get 10 likes. When I post something negative or see a friend that posts something negative, they get 10 times more likes. We all know that one. Our memory works the same way. And if we at age 10, 11, 12, and again, I'm not talking about the worst experiences, but if we've had someone who misunderstood us, and that's our reason at age 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 for saying I'm spiritual but not religious, and using that as an excuse for never stepping foot into a synagogue unless I absolutely have to because it's my cousin David's bar mitzvah. Well, maybe we're actually indeed using that as an excuse, and some of these further items matter. Mark Twain, maybe not the best person for a rabbi to quote, but Mark Twain once said, you should learn to not be like the cat. Because the cat who jumps on a hot stove will never again jump on a hot stove, but they will also never again jump on a cold stove. Second reason, hopefully I've gotten the most painful part of this video out of the way already. But the second part is the grass is always greener, or the exotic. The great educator of blessed memory from Seattle University in Seattle, Perry Lorenzo, defined the exotic as that which is unknown. So me living here in northern Germany, for many of you who are watching this from outside of Germany, is very exotic. As a matter of fact, where I live for people in Germany is very exotic. I'm here every day. For my wife who was born in this area, it's not exotic at all. This is what she's used to. And it's the same thing with religion. Oh my goodness, I can't find what I'm looking for, so maybe I look for something completely different. And why do you think it was a joke that if you wanted to find the Jews in a community, go to the Buddhist temple? It wasn't so much a joke. It was real for so many years, and it's still kind of the case because so many people in Judaism were not finding, again, I'm going to use the word spirituality, couldn't find it in their shul, couldn't find it for whatever reason, and so they decided to search for something different, exotic, outside. And I'm not even being critical. I think that we can learn massive amounts from other religious traditions, from other philosophies. The entire concept of Jewish renewal includes the idea of bringing thoughts and ideas in. And when I teach Kabbalah, I quote the Tao Te Ching, I quote Zen Buddhist texts, and as a Jew, I have no problem pulling from Orthodox thought, conservative thought, Reformed thought, secular humanist thought, and Hasidic thought as need be. But the challenge to this one is, how deeply did you look in Judaism, in your own tradition, regardless of where you're coming from? Because within Judaism, there is what one could call a spiritual path. There's meditative paths. There are mind-altering, out-of-body paths. Any of those things that are incredibly on the edges and boundaries of normativity are absolutely out there. And if we left Judaism, or we left formal religious Judaism and said, well, you know, I couldn't find a good meditative group in there, then very possible you weren't looking very hard, because they're absolutely out there. And hey, listen, this channel is going to be offering some of that. And right now I'm teaching a class on Kabbalah. So I promise you, especially in the internet age, that information is out there, which is going to lead me to my next few points. Number 3, and now it starts getting difficult again, and that is a society of looking for easy answers. 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all related to each other, because 4 is that religion takes work, 5 is that religion has boundaries, and 6 is that religion has obligations. And yes, I know soapbox, but we are living in a consumerist society, but from a spiritual or religious standpoint, the way that it affects us is the consumer society is buy this product and you will be happy. And we are trained. We are absolutely conditioned to believe that I should be able to learn to speak fluent French in 10 easy lessons, learn to have an out-of-body experience in 5 easy meditative classes, learn how to be happy with this or with that. And you know, it's interesting when you think of a spiritual path. Doesn't matter what tradition you're in, the spiritual experience, the out of the body, the expansive religious mystical experience is so universal that it's encountered in essentially every tradition. It's also encountered in non-religious traditions, encountered in music, and it's very parallel to what happens under the influence of things like psilocybin and ayahuasca. And if you want to read an amazing book on that one, read Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind. But if I can have that expansive mystical experience with the substance, and I'm not trying to be facetious or even negative with that, because studies that are going on right now of people that are in palliative care losing their fear of death, at least enough information out there to say this is worthy of thought at the very least. But that path from a time standpoint is very different than the many years of meditation and practice that it takes to sometimes have the same sorts of experiences within Judaism. And if we become completely accustomed to, all right, if I just buy the correct product, then I'm going to be happy, then, oh, is it going to be really difficult to actually want to do the daily repetition and the iteration and the knowledge that it takes in order to elevate oneself within a religious tradition. Number 4, indeed, religion takes work. Within Judaism, we have the obligation to pray 3 times a day. Just saying that sometimes is enough for people to say, all right, I'm never going to be a religious Jew or an observant Jew, because that in and of itself, and whatever the barriers are, sometimes it's the language, the Hebrew, the reading of the Hebrew, what it absolutely takes. And again, have you ever asked a rabbi, what are the ways to do that gradually over time? Is that even possible? Is it all or nothing? Is it either I can sit there in a prayer book as fast as possible, and you've heard people praying like that, and it's pretty impressive if you yourself can't do it. It seems exotic. But is there a different way to do that? When I say Jews are obligated to pray 3 times a day, does that mean that I have to pray exactly as is written in the most orthodox prayer book 3 times a day? And even in the Talmud, the answer is no. But yet the work it takes, especially if we didn't grow up in a tradition where that language is self-evident and easy, that feels like a stumbling block. That feels a barrier. And sometimes the statement, I'm spiritual but not religious, is just the unconscious wrestling against knowing how much work it's going to take to do what my fantasy is of what a Jewish religious life is. But that's just it. That's probably not what a Jewish religious life has to be. If we look at someone with a black hat or a shtreimel and say, I can't be that, and we compare ourselves to that, well, then we've made the same mistake that media makes. You want a picture of an Orthodox Jew? Go look for something out of a shtetl in Poland in 1620 instead of number 5, that religion has boundaries. This is something that I hear from, I would say, nearly 9 out of every 10 conversion candidate that I've worked with, who's especially in their 20s, and not heard it from them. These are some of the absolute most dedicated people I've ever worked with, but they're friends. And obviously, friends are curious, and if we're open with those around us with what we're doing, and oftentimes conversion candidates are, at least with Judaism, the first thing that people are going to ask is, why would you deliberately enter into a system where you can't eat exactly what you want to eat? Now, I'm not going to go much further into this. I'm going to put a link down below to a sermon I gave about a month ago where I addressed this in the sermon much better than I could address it right now. But freedom comes through boundaries. But if that's the reason that we don't want to enter into a Jewish religious life because we don't want someone telling us we can't have our BLT, that's why we say we're spiritual but not religious? How spiritual does it sound that that is the underlying excuse for not exploring our incredibly rich tradition? And finally, number 6, that religion has obligations. And this one saddens me. I've had people in my various different offices talking about their rights, their rights, their rights, their rights, their rights. And oftentimes I'll say, okay, we have rights, and there are rights that are part of being a member of a synagogue and being a member of a religious family. But what about the obligations? Now, I'll make the argument that life itself has obligations, and we're becoming somewhat unbalanced on that thought in the year 2021. But I think it's how much more so kal v'chomer within a religious tradition that we perceive our religion as a series of do's and don'ts, the unfortunately translated thou shalt nots of our traditions. And I just spent a few days writing a few chapters of my current book I'm working on dealing with the entire concept of thou shalt not. And if we're reducing Judaism, 5 books of Torah, the richness of the Tanakh, the 63 different tractates of the Talmud, the almost infinite libraries of midrashim and questions and answers, the she'alot utshuvot, and we're avoiding religion because we have a few obligations or because we have the fantasy that Judaism or whatever our religion is about what thou shalt and shalt not do. Well, of course that's in there, but that's a pretty small part of a much larger picture. So why should I care? I'm doing fine. My life is okay. I really don't need to worry about this whatsoever, and I'm going to give two different analogies. I'm sorry if you've been in one of my congregations, you've heard both of these analogies in at least 45,000 sermons. Analogy number one is the Kung Fu analogy. It's probably a little bit outdated. With UFC, we know that in order to win a street fight, you're probably going to need to learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instead of Kung Fu, but just stick with me because the Kung Fu one has movies that I can relate to. The Kung Fu analogy is how many of us deal with our religious and spiritual practices the way that we deal with Kung Fu. This idea that, oh, I watched a Bruce Lee film. If I'm out on the street and I need to defend myself, that should be enough, right? Of course, it's absurd. But the amount of people within religion that have that sort of idea, it's pretty scary. We see this as absurd because it's obviously absurd, and if we wanted to use self-defense, I can't imagine many of us would not understand that that would take constant work, iterative work, learning from a teacher who knows more than we do, learning with partners with whom we can learn and grow together. And the analogy gets even better because the hope, of course, by learning self-defense is that you will never be in a position of having to use it, whereas the analogous reasons for practicing a religion, I promise you, you will need to use it. Which brings me to my second, well, it's not even an analogy, it's just a reality. And it's a story that I can't tell in its fullness. It's a repetitive story over and over again that I can't tell in its fullness if I'm in a congregation, because this is guaranteed to get someone to want me to no longer work at that place. And that's this. I've been ordained almost exactly 10 years now as a rabbi, and although I haven't done 100 funerals yet, it's getting very, very close to 100 funerals. In the age of COVID, all of my colleagues, without exception, are doing more funerals than they ever have before, and it's been brutal. So when it comes to a funeral, it's not just doing the funeral. There is the preparation beforehand. There's the pastoral counseling with the bereaved, talking to them, helping through the bereavement process. And then there's the follow-up after the bereavement process. And out of those not quite 100 funerals that I've done, the vast majority of them, I've had to look into the eyes of someone as they've said, "Rabbi, tell me what I need to do." They don't necessarily mean the ritual stuff. I can help with that. That's my job, is to do the ritual stuff. What they're talking about is how do I deal with this? How do I marshal my resources? Give me the blessing, give me the prayer, give me the psalm to say. This is the street fight. This is where you need to know how to throw a punch and go to ground. This is the fulfillment of a spiritual path. Being able to marshal all of our resources when the tragedy happens in our life. Yes, religion and spirituality are more than that. We'll talk about celebration in just a moment. But all of us are going to lose someone. And this is not a one day and I'm over it. If you have the tool chest within Judaism, this is a year-long process to then come to a place of being able to step out of that valley of the shadow of death. But if we have no practice, if we don't know how to step into places of prayer and meditation and iterative processes around our holidays and understanding where we are in the Jewish calendar and understanding what the mitzvot are and how we can use those to elevate ourselves no matter how down we are, then we are going to be smacked down to the ground when this hits us. And I have had to over and over again not say, I can't help you. I can do the ritual. I can't give you my strength. I can't give you my practice. I can't tell you to say a psalm right now because it will be meaningless to you if you've never used the psalm in some sort of ritualistic practice. So what do? Right, that boundary between, I think that that's what an authentic expression of my religion is, or the religion that I want to be a part of is, and I don't know how to get there. Well, the answer is, it doesn't matter what your religious tradition is. If you want to begin to develop the Kung Fu, the Jiu-Jitsu muscles of Judaism, then there's actually three areas. One is prayer and meditation. The next is education. The other is celebration and commemoration. And that first one, I say prayer or meditation. Yes, there's great wisdom in Judaism that we pray 3 times a day. Actually, it's 5 times a day. That's for a different video. We just combine the first 2 and we combine the last 2. So we pray 5 times a day in 3 iterations, or sometimes 2, because Judaism's complicated and we have to make it as complicated as we possibly can. But that shouldn't be the barrier, because within Kabbalistic meditation, we can also withdraw ourselves from the stress of the moment when we wake up before we go to bed, and someplace in the middle of the day, an empty office, a conference room while we're walking, and we can close our eyes and focus on a name of the eternal and say that over and over again for 10 minutes or 5 minutes or 2 minutes. That's authentic prayer. That's just the first thing that comes to mind that I oftentimes tell people. How much time, if you are a Jew or you are working towards Judaism, does it take in the morning when you wake up to say Shema Yisrael Eloheinu Adonai Echad, and before you go to bed to say the same thing. But as you do it, after you are used to doing that, then adding one level of intentionality. We're all bound together. So who did I treat today as if they weren't a part of me, a part of the same greater reality? We've just taken the simplest statement in Jewish religious tradition and just turned it into a meditation on interconnectivity and a way to reflect on our own actions through a day. We can't do that a few times a day. By saying prayer or meditation, there's a lot of versions of them. And if we say, I can't do it the way I think it should be done, that means that that's the excuse. Second, education. The day that we stop taking in new information about our religion, about spirituality, about philosophy, about history, anything that, again, is going to lift us up. And this, again, goes to if we've got a finite amount of moments that we can get to drawing in new information. Most of us are doing that on pulling in information from our Hallelujah course, the people in our social media group that Moloch, the algorithm, has said that you're going to get that information because you already agree with the people or the stuff you read are going to make you mad. And is that really uplifting? And so maybe it's not Torah. Maybe it's not the Tanakh. Maybe it's not Talmud. Maybe it's starting off with a book that I'll recommend to you if you want. If you haven't read it, you know, everyone who knows me knows I'm going to say, read Lawrence Kushner's God Was in This Place and I did not know it. Start there. If it's the High Holy Days, I'll give you different recommendations. If you want to learn more about prayer, I'll give you different recommendations. Just leave the comments down below. Go to Limud, go to adult education at your own shul or at your local church, but do something that is pulling you away from Moloch, the algorithm, into interconnectivity and elevation and new ideas and things that challenge you and things that don't agree with what you already believe. And then finally, celebration or commemoration. Living a Jewish life means living aware in the Jewish calendar. And some of you have seen I've started a series of videos before every holiday, the iterative process of Judaism. In other words, every time we come to a holiday, what are the questions that are innate in that holiday for us to then ask and act upon and elevate ourselves so that we are spiraling up and elevating each other and ourselves over time through our traditions. So we take it seriously. We don't just show up for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because that's where we should show up, and we have a Passover Seder where we don't really want to be there and we try to get to the food as quickly as possible. Or we start asking the questions, what are the innate things that we can learn from the underlying truths and metaphors and symbols that are in each of these holidays, most especially Shabbat, which is happening once a week. If you unplug for those 25 hours, and if you do it with intentionality and deliberation, your life will transform much faster than the Learn French in 5 Easy Steps. That is a promise that will come true every single time because all of us are desperately need to pull ourselves away from that which is giving us anxiety. And if shul is that thing that's giving you anxiety, then identify what the anxiety is and take the responsibility to overcome that. And if that is too much, then find something that will not give that an anxiety. And if that's still too much, then find that place here with a resource on the internet that you can then do alone until you're able to overcome that. And if you can't overcome that, at least you've developed by yourself a spiritual process. You're starting to work on that kung fu. And sometimes it's not celebration, sometimes it's commemoration. It is for each of those people that I've lost, the candle that I light on the yort site. It's finding a minion so I can say Kaddish. You have no idea how much I've overcome from the difficulty of those memories just by having a commemoration that is repeated. That's religious. And notice something that's really funny. Meditation, prayer, education, and then the commemoration and celebration. Notice how spiritual those things are, which is my final point. What do you mean by spiritual? Define it for me. Define it for yourself. Write in the comments down below what you mean by that. You might profoundly disagree with me. Good. But what do you mean? Do you know what you mean? What are you talking about? Do you know that in Judaism, there wasn't a word for spirituality until the last 2 centuries? The word's ruchaniyut. It's a beautiful word. It's from one of the words that we have for the soul, either 3 or 5, depending on how you ask. Sounds like a video for a different day. But we didn't have a word for spirituality because the idea was there was no separation between body and spirit. We perform the mitzvot. We do our sacred obligations from within our bodies. Therefore, what we do with our bodies is holy. It's elevated. So if within Judaism we say, I need to find something more spiritual, what Judaism is saying is we need to find with our own body presences, with our mind, with who we are as a person, we need to find a way to be able to elevate ourselves, to be more connected with ourselves, with others, with our tradition, with the world. So that's it. Another long, heavy video. Again, welcome to Beit Virtuali. I've been wanting to do this one for a while. This one for me has been absolutely necessary as I continue in my own personal struggles with making sure that I am in an iterative process of my religion. I think the ultimate way to say this is I develop my spirituality through a religious tradition. And yeah, I left off reasons that I could have put on there. Sometimes we say I'm spiritual but not religious because we really, really dislike the dogma. Notice what I haven't said on how to live a religious life. Notice the word belief has not come in here at all. I deliberately left it out of this entire video because that's the final reason that we so often stay away from religion. We just don't believe. But yet I've spent more than 20 minutes talking about a religious path leading to a greater sense of interconnectivity, to spirituality, and I haven't once talked about belief. I've talked about responsibility and obligation. The underlying thing is that we have a responsibility to ourselves to be whole and healed. So thank you all for being a part of Beit Virtuali. For those of you who have made it this far, please hit the like button. It actually really does make a difference as we're still very much at the beginning. We haven't even been doing this 3 months now. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to this channel. And if you're interested in adult education or just supporting the work that we do, please go to patreon.com/BeitVirtuali and become a member. With that, go figure out something to start your religiosity, to start your religion, to start your relationship with daily ritual. And as you do that, you will find yourself wanting to lift someone else up as you're lifting yourself up. And as through this, we're all being lifted up together. Take care. We'll see you next time.
אהבת עולם, בית ישראל, עמך אהבת. תורה ומצוות, חוקים, משפטים אותנו לימדת. תורה ומצוות, חוקים, משפטים